He was so much more than a footballer. You see, he was a king, a symbol, and really a figure who embodied the whole complicated history of a nation and its empire. So, in this explainer, we're going to dive into the two lives of Eusébio da Silva Ferreira. And those words, they're from another Portuguese legend, Luís Fico. And he nails it, right? It perfectly captures the sheer scale of Eusébio's legacy. He wasn't just a player. No, he was this eternal legend, a benchmark, the guy everyone else would be measured against for generations to come.
All right, so to really get a handle on Eusébio's incredible impact on Portugal, we're actually going to start at the end. His final resting place, well, it tells us more about his legacy than any stadium ever could.
Just think about the weight of that for a second. The national pantheon. This isn't for just anybody. We're talking about the final resting place for the absolute giants of Portuguese history. And Eusébio, he was the very first sportsman and the first Black person ever to be entombed there. His name right alongside the nation's most revered heroes. So that just raises this huge question, right? And it's the question that's going to drive this whole explainer. How did this happen? How on earth did a boy from one of the poorest neighborhoods in a Portuguese colony end up becoming an immortal hero? A king among poets? Well, to answer that, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning, to a world that was 1,000,000 miles away from the grandeur of that pantheon. Okay, so we're in Mafala. It's a neighborhood in what was then called Lourenço Marques in Mozambique. I want you to picture it. Unpaved streets, houses made of zinc and bamboo, not a lot of electricity or running water. This was the world Eusébio was born into, all under the flag of the Portuguese colonial empire. His biographer, João Malheiro, paints such a powerful picture of it. He said, Eusébio and his friends would skip school just to play football, most of the time barefoot, with a ball that was literally made of socks stuffed with newspapers. You know, this wasn't just a game for them. It was an escape. It was a passion that was forged in poverty. And yet, from those dirt fields, a superstar was about to emerge. Once he got to Europe, they gave him a nickname that would stick forever, the Black Panther. I mean, his rise was just absolutely meteoric. He lands in Lisbon as a teenager in 1960. 5 years later, boom, he's crowned the best player in Europe. And by 1966, he's a full-blown global superstar, about to take the World Cup by storm. And this one little story, it just perfectly captures the man behind the legend. Just imagine this for a second. You're 23 years old, you're driving your car, and you hear on the radio that you've just been named the best footballer in all of Europe. That's really how Eusébio found out he'd won the Ballon d'Or. It's such a simple, almost accidental moment for such an incredible achievement. 733. Let that number sink in. That is how many goals he scored in his professional career. We're talking nearly a goal for every single game he played. This wasn't just talent, you know? It was this rare mix of explosive speed, unbelievable power, and the genius of being able to use both feet. But Eusébio's story isn't just about football. Not even close. His entire career played out against this really complex and turbulent political backdrop, one that would turn him into something way more than just an athlete. So you have to understand, at the time, Portugal was ruled by the Estado Novo. This was an authoritarian nationalist regime led by a guy named Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. And a huge priority for this regime was holding on to its African colonies, places like Mozambique and Angola, especially while other European powers were letting theirs go. Now, to justify keeping these colonies, the regime pushed this ideology called Luso-tropicalism. The idea basically was that Portugal was a special kind of colonizer. The story they told was that they weren't racist, but were uniquely capable of creating this harmonious, multiracial society across different continents. And wouldn't you know it, the regime saw sports as the perfect propaganda tool. I mean, take a look at this poster. It's bragging about building stadiums and sports centers, and it says right there, none of this existed before 1926. The message couldn't be clearer. The Estado Novo brings progress and unity, even through football. And this is where Eusébio becomes absolutely crucial. While Portugal is literally fighting colonial wars in Africa, its national football team, with white players from mainland Portugal and black players like Eusébio from the colonies, was held up as the perfect symbol of this so-called multiracial harmony. See, Eusébio wasn't just a player anymore. He was living, breathing proof of the regime's biggest propaganda point. But can you imagine what that must have felt like? To be that symbol, to be a black man from Africa who is being celebrated as a national hero of the very same empire that's fighting a war to keep his homeland a colony. That is a heavy weight to carry. Just think about that famous image of him, the one with tears streaming down his face after losing to England in the '66 World Cup semifinal. It's one of the most iconic images of heartbreak in all of sports. Just pure, raw, human emotion. But behind that emotion was a man navigating a world filled with these massive personal and political contradictions. Okay, to really get his position, you need to understand this one term, assimilado. So under colonial law, most Africans were officially classified as indigenous, or indigenous people. But a tiny, tiny fraction who met certain standards, education, culture, stuff like that, could become assimilados, or assimilated, people like Eusébio. This granted them Portuguese citizenship, but what it really did was create a very clear racial and social hierarchy. And this whole situation, it created this dual legacy for him. In Portugal, he was a national hero, no question, an ambassador for the entire nation. But back in his homeland, Mozambique, the view was, well, it was a lot more complicated. Yeah, he was a football god, for sure. But for some, he was also the idol who chose the colonizer, the metatrope, over the colony. Listen to this quote from a former president of Portugal. He said Eusébio was a simple person with little education, but very pleasant to be around. Now, that was probably meant as a compliment, but it really reveals the role Eusébio was often pushed into. They called it the bom rapaz, or the good boy. Describing him as simple and pleasant, well, it reinforced this image of a non-threatening figure. He was the ideal assimilated African, grateful, not political, and a perfect, manageable symbol for the state. And all of this, it brings us right back to where we started, back to the Pantheon, to his final resting place, and to what his incredible story ultimately tells us about Portugal itself. You know, it seems like everyone who ever met him said the exact same thing. That he was humble, he was warm, he was so generous. His typical autograph wasn't just his name. He'd write, "Como um abraço do Eusébio," with a hug from Eusébio. And that tiny detail, it just speaks volumes, doesn't it? It shows you the real personal warmth that somehow existed right alongside the immense weight of being a political symbol. So, in the end, Eusébio's life really forces us to ask this pretty profound question. When a person becomes a symbol for a whole nation, especially during a time of huge historical conflict and change, can their story ever really be just their own? His life was his, of course, but it was also the story of an empire, of a war, and of a country struggling with its own identity. And that is a legacy every bit as powerful as any goal he ever scored.